29 days. That was the number Doug Ford put on the table Wednesday as he stood before reporters in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, alongside 12 other provincial and territorial leaders. They had arrived for their annual summer meeting, but instead found themselves operating more like an emergency trade council. 29 days until the 50% tariff signed in Washington the previous Monday officially takes effect. 29 days for Mark Carney, as Ford put it, to take the lead and produce a strong plan. And so far, Carney has chosen to use those days in the exact opposite way nearly every earlier chapter of this trade war was handled. No immediate retaliation, no announcement of a counter-tariff list, no attempt to answer 50% with another 50%. Instead, he is waiting, negotiating, and trying to turn a room filled with premiers who agree on very little in Canadian politics into something that at least resembles a united front. The obvious question, the one nearly every headline around this story keeps circling without fully answering, is why? Why would a prime minister facing the largest single tariff escalation of this entire 18-month trade fight choose silence instead of a strike, patience instead of pressure, and a phone call instead of issuing a proclamation of his own? The answer is not weakness. It is arithmetic, timing, and a careful reading of the American political system that Ottawa has been developing for months. And this week in Charlottetown, you can watch that strategy unfolding in real time. Think for a moment about what the instinctive response might have looked like, because this trade war has already produced that kind of reaction before. When Trump's first round of tariffs hit Canadian steel and aluminum in early 2025, Ottawa answered within weeks, announcing 30 billion Canadian dollars in counter-tariffs on American products selected specifically to create pressure in politically sensitive U.S. states. When Trump imposed 25% tariffs on automobiles in April of last year, Carney responded to that as well, announcing a 25% surcharge on non-CUSMA-compliant American vehicles within days. For most of the first year of this trade war, the pattern was straightforward: tariff for tariff, roughly equal, and usually immediate. That pattern is exactly what Washington now points to in defending Monday's proclamations. Canada, unlike other American trading partners, continued answering American tariffs with tariffs of its own. This week, for the first time in this trade war at this level, Ottawa chose not to follow that playbook. Understanding why matters, because it reveals how this conflict has changed in ways that one dramatic retaliation announcement would completely miss. I'm Mike Carter. This is the Decision Room, where we break down the geopolitical, military, and economic choices shaping the world. No filler, no spin, just the story told directly. To understand why waiting is the strategy rather than evidence that there is no strategy, you need to see exactly what Carney is waiting for and what happens to Canada's position if he moves too soon. On Monday, July 20th, Trump signed 3 proclamations under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, an almost century-old law that had not been used since 1949. The statute allows tariffs of up to 50% against countries judged to be discriminating against American commerce. The 3 proclamations specifically target Canadian automobiles, alcohol, and dairy. They cite Canada's own 25% retaliatory surcharge on non-CUSMA-compliant American vehicles, the decision by all but 2 Canadian provinces to stop selling American alcohol through their government-run liquor boards, and Canada's long-standing dairy supply management system. The tariffs apply to roughly $20 billion in Canadian exports, including wine, hockey sticks, cement, furniture, machinery, textiles, and other goods. Most importantly, they apply even when those products would normally qualify for duty-free treatment under CUSMA. The measures are scheduled to begin 30 days after they were signed. Count forward from July 20th, and the deadline lands on August 19th. Carney's public response came the same day the proclamations were signed. He described the move as the latest in a series of unilateral American trade actions that violate the agreement Trump himself helped negotiate during his first term. The following morning, Carney told reporters that he had spoken with Trump by phone and that both leaders had agreed to deepen and accelerate negotiations over the coming weeks. When he was asked directly whether Canada would retaliate, he stopped short of announcing anything. Instead, he said Canada had already presented a series of detailed and comprehensive proposals designed to resolve the dispute and modernize CUSMA, and that Ottawa was ready to intensify those discussions. Then he added a carefully aimed line, one directed as much toward American audiences as Canadian ones. This trade dispute has raised costs for families, especially in the United States. That is the federal government's position, but it is not the only Canadian voice shaping this story. The difference between the calm coming from Ottawa and the much hotter tone coming from the provinces is one of the most revealing parts of what is happening this week. Canada's premiers were already scheduled to gather in Charlottetown for the Council of the Federation's annual summer meeting, hosted by Prince Edward Island Premier Rob Lance. Normally, the gathering would focus on healthcare funding, interprovincial trade, and other domestic issues largely separate from the Canada-US relationship. Washington's announcement on Monday turned it into something entirely different. The three-day meeting opened Tuesday with a session involving Indigenous leaders, and even before the tariff news arrived, the premiers were facing a difficult agenda. Provincial and territorial leaders were already dealing with wildfire response, growing separatist sentiment in at least 2 provinces, and continuing affordability pressures. Then, the Section 338 proclamations landed on the opening day of the meeting, forcing 13 premiers who disagree on almost every major domestic issue to spend a significant part of their summer gathering, coordinating a response to a crisis none of them had planned to discuss. Carney briefed all 13 premiers virtually during the Monday and Tuesday sessions, promising to intensify trade negotiations over what he described as the next 28 days. That number had already dropped by 1 from Ford's 29-day countdown, but both were pointing toward the same August 19th deadline. Carney was also preparing to travel to Charlottetown on Thursday to meet the premiers face-to-face in a full First Minister's meeting. That change in format matters. It shows how seriously Ottawa is taking provincial support for whatever happens next, and it reflects a deliberate decision to make federal-provincial unity visible instead of managing the entire response through private diplomatic channels. Doug Ford, Ontario's premier, and the most outspoken supporter of a tougher Canadian position throughout this trade war, did not soften his message for the cameras in Charlottetown. Speaking from Ontario's perspective, he said everything remained on the table, that Canada could not continue rolling over for Trump, and that negotiations had to come from strength rather than weakness, especially when dealing with this particular American president. But the second half of Ford's statement revealed more than the first. He made it clear that responsibility for the actual strategy belonged to Carney, and that the Prime Minister needed to lead and deliver a strong plan within the next 29 days. Ford was applying pressure, but at the same time, he was accepting the federal timetable rather than announcing independent countermeasures from Ontario. That difference is crucial. The provinces can raise the political temperature, but the authority to make the final trade decision remains with the federal government. Carney's calm approach depends on preserving exactly that structure. The other premiers who spoke from the same meeting offered a wider range of views, revealing how contested this strategy remains within Canada's federation. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe told reporters he was optimistic that an agreement could be reached in the near term. That confidence was notable because Saskatchewan's canola and agricultural exports had been among the sectors hit hardest during earlier rounds of the trade conflict. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith sounded more urgent. She said it was time to narrow the focus and secure a comprehensive agreement before the tariffs took effect on August 19th. Alberta itself had been less exposed than some other provinces, but Smith emphasized that she wanted a deal covering all unresolved issues for every region, not simply protections for her own province. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew gave the clearest explanation of the strategy behind provincial cooperation. When facing a much larger opponent, he said, unity was essential. Not every premier believed an agreement was close, but the room collectively chose to support the federal negotiating position instead of breaking apart into separate provincial responses. That unity gave Carney a kind of leverage he did not need to create through legislation or diplomacy. It only required 13 premiers to decide that a divided Canadian response would be more damaging than a patient one. This is where the story begins to shift, because the question of why Carney is waiting has several concrete structural answers that go far beyond political tone. On Wednesday, Washington provided some of those answers directly. While the premiers were meeting in Charlottetown, United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer was appearing before the Senate Finance Committee in Washington. The hearing, titled The President's 2026 Trade Policy Agenda, was chaired by Idaho Republican Mike Crapo. Greer was there to defend the Section 338 tariffs before senators from both parties, including members of the president's own political side. His defense rested on two main arguments. The first focused on the administration's claim that Canada had engaged in discriminatory trade practices. Greer said Washington had spent more than a year trying to persuade Canada to remove those measures. He argued that Canada had received what he described as the best trade treatment available anywhere in the world during the previous year, but had continued responding with retaliatory actions. According to that logic, escalation had become necessary because Canada kept answering American tariffs with tariffs of its own. The second argument was much broader. Greer told the committee that the total American trade deficit, which reached approximately $1.22 trillion in 2025, represented a national emergency by itself. That framing placed the action against Canada inside a larger global trade campaign, rather than treating it as a standalone dispute between two neighboring countries. More importantly, Greer offered his own timeline for how the conflict might eventually be resolved. He said he was hopeful that the United States could reach some temporary or interim trade agreements with Canada and Mexico before the end of the year. But he also acknowledged that the deeper structural disputes within CUSMA would probably not be fully addressed until sometime in 2027. That admission deserves close attention. Washington's own trade representative was confirming under oath, in front of the Senate committee responsible for overseeing his authority, that the core disagreement would not be solved quickly, regardless of what either side did during the next 29 days. When the official imposing the tariffs does not expect the underlying conflict to be settled until the following year, the pressure on Carney to produce an immediate, dramatic counterattack within a single news cycle becomes far less intense. Ottawa is not racing toward a deadline that will end the trade war. It is preparing for a longer negotiation that both governments already seem to expect will continue well beyond August. There is also a second, more immediate reason why waiting strengthens Carney's position more than instant retaliation would, and it appeared during that same Senate hearing. This time, it came not from Greer, but from the senators questioning him. Oregon Democrat Ron Wyden challenged Greer with a specific and uncomfortable comparison. He asked whether, once the new tariffs took effect, some Canadian products could face higher duties than comparable goods imported from China. Greer responded that in the broader picture, tariffs on China remained significantly higher overall. That was true across most categories. But Wyden's staff had examined the rates product by product and found real examples in which a 50% tariff on Canadian goods would exceed the duty placed on similar Chinese products outside the electric vehicle sector. That is more than a minor talking point. It means American senators, speaking publicly and on the official congressional record, are now arguing that in certain categories, Washington is treating one of its closest allies more harshly than its main strategic competitor. Every day that argument remains in the congressional record without Canada having to create or promote it is another day working in Ottawa's favor. The criticism is being generated inside Washington by Washington's own elected officials on Washington's own political ground. And the Senate Finance Committee hearing did not end with an uncomfortable comparison between Canada and China. Democratic senators also used the session to push forward a legislative effort that would remove tariff authority from the president altogether. That represents a direct institutional challenge developing inside Congress independently of anything Canada says or does. It is not retaliation from Ottawa. It is not a Canadian countermeasure. It is the American legislative branch pushing back against the American executive branch's use of the exact statute the White House selected because it believed the law would be more difficult to challenge than earlier tariff tools. Those earlier mechanisms, including IEEPA and Section 122, had already faced legal attacks, and in IEEPA's case, the Supreme Court struck its use down entirely in February. If the congressional effort gains momentum, it could limit Washington's tariff power far more effectively than any list of Canadian counter-tariffs. And it could do so without Canada spending a single dollar of economic leverage or damaging relationships with American businesses and political figures Ottawa wants to keep on its side. There is another reason Canada can afford to remain patient, one that goes beyond the immediate mechanics of this particular tariff. It connects to a broader pattern that has been developing for months. Carney's reference to Canada's detailed and comprehensive proposals for modernizing CUSMA was not simply vague diplomatic language. Ottawa had been preparing specific positions, sector by sector, on automobiles, dairy, and digital trade for months. Those proposals were developed alongside a much larger effort to reduce the ability of any single decision from Washington to determine Canada's entire economic direction. Since taking office, Carney had pursued strategic partnerships across 5 continents. His government worked toward a reset with China over canola tariffs in January, signed a partnership with Saudi Arabia in Jeddah in July, opened trade discussions with India, the ASEAN bloc, and Mercosur countries, and advanced a domestic effort to eliminate barriers to trade between Canadian provinces. Economists estimated that removing those internal restrictions could unlock as much as $200 billion in economic activity without relying on the United States at all. None of those initiatives makes the roughly $20 billion in exports covered by Monday's tariffs painless. Canadian producers would still face real disruption and real financial damage. But the broader portfolio means Carney is not negotiating from a position in which this one dispute determines Canada's entire economic future. That is exactly the kind of position that makes patience affordable instead of simply convenient. There is one more factor in the timing calculation: litigation. Section 338 has never been tested in court because it has never previously been used to impose an actual tariff. Every other major instrument used during the past year and a half of this trade war, including IEEPA and Section 122, faced a legal challenge within days of being announced. Those cases were usually brought by American importers, the businesses that pay the duty directly when goods cross the border. Wine distributors, furniture retailers, and cement suppliers, now facing 50% charges on Canadian products with no easy domestic replacement, have every financial reason to sue. They could bring a case before the same Court of International Trade that had already ruled against 2 other tariff mechanisms used by the administration earlier in the year. If a lawsuit is filed and produces even a temporary injunction before August 19th, the entire strategic calculation changes without Ottawa having to escalate at all. Carney's statements describing the tariffs as a violation of CUSMA are phrased carefully enough to keep that legal possibility open without requiring the Canadian government itself to become the plaintiff. It is also important to understand who pays a 50% tariff in the immediate term, because that determines which American groups may end up applying political pressure on Canada's behalf without being asked. The duty is collected from the American importer of record at the border, not directly from the Canadian producer. That could be a liquor distributor in New York importing Canadian wine, a furniture retailer in Ohio carrying Canadian-made cabinets, or a construction supplier in Michigan purchasing Canadian cement. Starting August 19th, those are the businesses that would write the check to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. They would then pass much of that cost into the prices paid by American consumers. Each of those companies has a congressional representative it can contact, a local news organization willing to report on price increases, and a direct financial incentive to challenge the tariff through the American political system. Carney does not have to build or coordinate that pressure himself. Once the tariff begins costing American businesses real money, rather than merely threatening to do so, the pressure starts organizing on its own. Put all of those pieces together, and the strategic logic behind the next 29 days becomes much easier to see. If Canada retaliated immediately, it would give Washington exactly the evidence its own tariff justification already claims exists, that Canada, unlike other American allies, responds to American tariffs by imposing tariffs of its own. An instant countermeasure would also interrupt three separate processes that are already moving in Canada's favor without requiring Ottawa to introduce a single new policy. The first is Greer's own acknowledgement that the deeper dispute will take years rather than weeks to resolve, which removes much of the pressure for Carney to deliver a dramatic answer immediately. The second is the pushback developing inside the United States Senate, where American lawmakers are now placing Canada's argument directly into the congressional record. The third is the legal uncertainty surrounding a statute that has never actually been tested in court. Waiting is not evidence that there is no plan. For as long as those three forces continue moving in a direction that benefits Ottawa, without Canada having to spend political or economic capital, waiting itself is the plan. That does not mean Carney can delay forever. Doug Ford's 29-day countdown captures the very real pressure building underneath the federal government's calm public language. If August 19th arrives without a negotiated exemption for automobiles, alcohol, or dairy, and without a court order delaying the tariffs, Carney will face a choice he has so far been able to postpone. He will have to decide whether the measured, non-escalatory approach that defined this week can survive once the tariff is no longer only a threat and begins being collected at the border. Thursday's First Minister's meeting in Charlottetown is effectively the moment when Carney must enter a room with all 13 premiers and either present a believable path toward a resolution within that window or explain why continued patience remains the correct decision while the countdown moves closer to zero. It will also be important to watch the premiers who are less convinced that unity and patience will be enough. Not every leader at the Charlottetown table shared Scott Moe's confidence or Danielle Smith's sense of urgency in exactly the same way. CBC's reporting from the second day of the summer meeting made the distinction clear. The premiers publicly rallied behind Carney, but privately, not all of them believed an agreement was close. That space between public solidarity and private uncertainty is the real pressure point Carney is trying to control. His challenge is not limited to the external threat coming from Washington. He must also keep 13 provincial leaders aligned behind the same strategy, several of whom have strong political reasons to appear tougher than the Prime Minister, particularly in an environment shaped by approaching elections. The difficulty is that the payoff from Carney's strategy, assuming it arrives at all, may not become visible until long after the 29-day countdown has ended. There are three possible paths at the end of this specific deadline. The first is that the intensified negotiations Carney and Trump agreed to on Tuesday produce a narrow, sector-specific exemption from one or more of the three proclamations. The most likely area would be the automobile surcharge, because it is tied to a single, recent Canadian measure that could potentially be adjusted without reopening the much older and more difficult dairy dispute before August 19th. This is the result every premier in Charlottetown said they wanted, including those who were less confident it could be achieved within the available time. It would also allow both governments to present the outcome as a victory to their own domestic audiences. Washington would receive a concession it could present as proof that its pressure worked, while Ottawa would gain a resolution it could describe as the result of successful negotiation rather than surrender. The second possibility is that the 29 days expire without an agreement. The tariffs take effect as planned, and Canada continues with a measured response instead of immediately escalating, calculating that congressional resistance, legal uncertainty, and Greer's own multi-year timeline will continue doing more for Ottawa than a new list of Canadian counter-tariffs. This option would impose real costs on Canadian exporters beginning August 19th, but it would keep every other process moving: the expected court challenges, the effort in Congress to restrict presidential tariff powers, and the wider CUSMA negotiations that Greer has already said may not be fully resolved until 2027. All of those forces would still be operating in a way that supports patience over immediate pressure. Under that scenario, Carney would need to give the provinces something credible by Thursday's meeting or soon afterward. It would not necessarily have to be a completed agreement, but it would need to be a convincing explanation of why waiting remains the stronger choice, even after the tariff becomes an actual cost instead of a looming threat. The third possibility is that one of the external pressures moves faster than anyone expects. A court could issue an early injunction based on reasoning similar to the major questions doctrine that brought down the use of IEEPA in February. The Senate effort to limit the president's tariff authority could gain sudden momentum, especially if enough Republicans join Democrats in expressing the kind of concern that some committee members reportedly raised this week. Or domestic pressure inside the United States could rise quickly enough to change Washington's calculation. Wine importers, furniture retailers, construction suppliers, and senators hearing from constituents about higher prices could create enough noise that the administration finds a reason to soften or delay the August 19th deadline before Canada is forced to make its own decision. The larger meaning of this week in Charlottetown is that the absence of Canadian counter-tariffs does not mean the absence of a strategy. It is a calculated bet based on 18 months of watching how this trade conflict behaves whenever it escalates. Carney appears to believe that the most valuable move right now is not to match Washington's pressure with equal pressure from Canada, but to let Washington's own institutions do work Ottawa would otherwise have to spend real economic leverage to accomplish. The courts, the Senate, American businesses, and even the trade representatives' admission that the negotiations could stretch across several years are all creating pressure inside the United States without Canada having to generate it directly. 29 days is not a long period, but it may be long enough to see whether patience, backed by 13 premiers standing together in Prince Edward Island, can outlast the impact of a dramatic headline. Whether that gamble succeeds will probably not be obvious on August 19th itself, no matter which of these three paths the dispute follows. Carney's broader approach over the past several months has depended on a much longer-term wager, that results measured over years matter more than victories measured over a single news cycle. A more diversified export base, a stable and modernized CUSMA relationship, and a Canadian trade relationship with the United States rebuilt on more balanced terms would matter far more than which government appears tougher during 1 week of political coverage. This week in Charlottetown, with 13 premiers involved, a virtual briefing already completed, and a full First Minister's meeting still ahead, is simply the latest test of whether that wager can continue to hold. I'll see you when the next decision lands.